What are the ramifications of President Trump's support of President Zelensky in Ukraine and his animosity toward President Putin and Russia? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that you all know brings you the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again for another round.
It's good to be with you and, of course, our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, so Richard, there's been some big developments now with respect to the Ukraine-Russia war. Um, it seems that President Putin is leaning toward possibly having a meeting with President Zelensky of Ukraine, something that it seems he has long resisted. At the same time, what I think is so strange in this whole phenomenon, and I would hope that our conversation at least focuses on this theme to a large extent, is what appears to be President Trump's flip-flop. I mean, I remember there was a time when people were accusing Trump of being a Russian agent. I mean, I think that was the whole idea in his first term of the Robert Mueller report, that people were convinced that he was tied in with Putin, that they were allies. They were more than allies. That the allegation was that Trump was an agent to the Russians, a secret agent. And that was the idea of this special counsel or independent counsel, Robert Mueller, doing this investigation. And I remember every day for about a year, people were saying, Robert Mueller's going to save us, Jacob. Robert Mueller's going to save us. And all the leftists and the mainstream press were saying it every day. When is Robert Mueller going to come out with his report so he can save us from Donald Trump? And the idea was that Mueller was going to prove that Trump was a Russian agent and therefore he'd be impeached and removed from office. And then, of course, he got exonerated. Mueller's investigation found that no, there wasn't any evidence of such a thing. But nonetheless, when Trump was campaigning for office this time, it was clear that he was aligned with Putin. He even made a remark. This may have been after he became president again, that Ukraine and Zelensky had started the war, and it was clear that he had a solid relationship with Putin. And then there was that famous meeting in the White House with J.D. Vance and Zelensky where they just tore this guy to shreds. Trump and Vance tore Zelensky to shreds, just humiliated the guy. And so it's always been clear to me that Trump was aligned with Russia or trying to devoted to establishing friendly relations with Russia and bring an end to this forever anti-Russia hostility that goes back to even before 1945. But that's what drove the whole Cold War and stuff. And all of a sudden, out of the clear blue, it appears to me that Trump has made a 180, a complete 180, where he's now aligned with Zelensky. He's saying that he's resuming arms shipments to Zelensky when he had threatened to cut him off. He's threatening sanctions on Russia. It's like I'm living in this surreal world. Like, what the heck is going on here? They don't even need a Robert Mueller anymore to make all these accusations because Trump himself is taking this antagonistic approach to Putin. Now, I've got my own theory as to why this has happened, but let me pass it over to you and have you set the context or let me know what you think about all this.
Well, I think that, going back to when uh, Trump was running for president the first time, and certainly uh, the campaign for this now re-election of him 4 years later, uh, his general approach was that he was suspicious of America's foreign wars. Why was America going out on these campaigns that cost American lives and hundreds of billions, if not, if you count all the costs of Afghanistan and Iraq, trillions of dollars. Uh, and the spreading of American military might through bases on virtually every continent, and that America was a sucker. America claiming that it needed to be there to preserve the freedom of the world, while all the other countries with whom we were formally aligned or informally connected were getting free rides, not devoting money to their own defense budgets, taking for granted American financial support or foreign aid, and that the Americans were suckers to subsidize the world when they were not willing to support their own defense, and resources were being taken out of the pockets of Americans to serve foreign purposes having nothing to do with rightly understood domestic affairs. Uh, if not an isolationist position, certainly with a tone in the campaigns of a significantly greater degree of non-interventionism in foreign affairs than had been the case since the beginning of the Cold War, World War II. Uh, and that seemed to be the case, particularly with him coming into office with this second term. He campaigned on, well, I will end this war between Russia and Ukraine in 24 hours. Well, you can put that down, of course, to campaign rhetoric and his usual bombastic approach to things. But it seemed as if that's what he was doing. He was pressuring the Ukrainians to not be so dogmatic. He was saying that Putin had reasonable grounds for his own foreign policy concerning Ukraine due to prior American foreign policy and intervention in Ukraine, and that things could come together. Things could come together. I interpret this. Uh, I have a sense of where your interpretation will go, uh, but I see it slightly a different way at a different level of the analysis. And that is, Trump really believes, because if you just look at him with the trade deals and everything else, he really believes that everything is just a deal. You have some things you want, I have some things I want, a third party might have certain things they want, and we just cut a deal. And as he said to Zelensky in that Oval Office meeting, you don't have any cards to play. So whoever has the stronger hand obviously is going to get the better deal compared to the other partners in the transaction. And that's his mindset. Well, this is a terrible war. That people are dying. The cities are being attacked with these drones. The Russians are dying. Ukrainians are dying. And for what? Well, let's just get together and cut a deal. But the problem is that he's dealing with two opponents who aren't interested in deals. The reason why Zelensky spoke out in the Oval Office, which resulted in the strong responses by both Trump and Vance, is that Zelensky at one level believes that right and justice is on Ukraine's side. Who are the Russians to invade our country? And borders are supposed to be inviolable. Yeah, let's have peace. And the Russians withdraw from all territory defined by Ukraine's borders in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Putin, on the other hand, says we have to get at the root causes. And what are the root causes for him? He views that Russia has a right to a sphere of influence, certainly in the former Soviet republics. He basically already has a puppet regime in Belarus by propping up Lukashenko and has for decades now. He plays these games in the Caucasus republics of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and the Central Asian republics like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and so on. He believes that this is Russia's sphere. And he also believes that Russia has a destiny to defend the world against Westernism, against liberalism, against Western defining of democracy, against individual liberty, because he's a nationalist collectivist. And his demands are the root causes is no NATO, no European Union. Ukraine has no significant armed forces, and the government has to be changed into one that is subservient or at least tacitly accepting Soviet dominance, Russian dominance. And that's that. So you have these two conflicting views. There's no deal to be cut. There's no deal to be cut. And Trump thinks there is. And so he's put pressure on Zelensky to at least talk. And then he tries to butter up Putin. Yes, yes, this and that and the other. And Putin has his own heels dug in the ground. He keeps talking about root causes, which means I win. I get everything I want because I don't care how many people die. I don't care how many Russians die, and I don't care how many people die through drone attacks on Ukrainian cities. I win. End of story. And Trump is taken aback by this because he's very naive and thinks in this negotiating setting. And now he's upset. First, he was upset with Zelensky, and now he's upset with Russia. The problem is Zelensky and Ukraine cannot do anything to the United States. They live off American military and financial support. There would be no Ukrainian ability to defend itself within a few months if Trump, in fact, cut off all American military and financial support, because the European Union countries do not have the financial ability to replace all of that themselves. Russia, on the other hand, is a force to be reckoned with. They have nuclear missiles, and they're not afraid to say they would use it. Now, you could say this is bombastic rhetoric as well, but Medvedev, who is part of Putin's government and was formerly a president in between Putin's terms as his own president, like there were 4 years when Putin wasn't president, the same way there were 4 years that Trump wasn't president. He goes on their version of social media and says if the United States plays these games, they're risking a nuclear war. So what is Trump's response? He announces that there's two nuclear submarines with nuclear missiles about to move into areas closer to Russia because of Medvedev's threatening remarks. This is a difficult game that Trump is playing because he doesn't understand that sometimes people don't care about the cost the same way he thinks people weigh the costs and the benefits and just want to cut a deal. And since he's Trump and is the great negotiator and the deal maker, why would they turn me down? I'm America. And his naivete and the dogmatism and the intransigence of Putin means that if America is going to follow this path, that means if Trump is going to follow this path, where he plays like I'm the king and I decide foreign policy as well as everything else, this could easily lead to a mistake that nobody wants, and Trump would be caught in because he plays this game.
Well, you brought up some really interesting insights, and my my take on that incorporates some of what you said, but it's a little bit different twist as you suggested. Um, I think you mentioned NATO, and I think NATO is at the root of this. That at the end of the Cold War, the when the Soviet Union dismantled and Germany reunited and Soviet troops exited Eastern Europe, the American politicians promised that NATO would not expand eastward. And they told the Russians, you don't need to worry about this. And the I think that NATO should have been dismantled at that point. I mean, the whole purpose of NATO was the Cold War, and the Cold War was over. So it's like this Cold War dinosaur that was permitted to remain in existence, but it didn't stay where it was. It began moving eastward. And I'll give you my reasons as to why I think that happened. But they began absorbing all these Eastern European countries, which enabled US nuclear missiles and German troops. Germany is the nation that invaded Russia in the Second World War and absolutely decimated the nation. You could move these troops closer and closer to Russia's borders. And Russia kept saying, Putin kept saying, you got to stop. You got to stop. We don't want your missiles or your troops right on our border. And okay, one can argue that, well, tough luck, Putin. These are independent nations. They have a right to join NATO if they want to, but we all know that the US would not take that approach if, say, Russia was putting nuclear missiles in Cuba. If they said, well, Cuba's an independent nation, it's got a right to have these nuclear missiles there from Russia. We all know what the U.S. response was because the U.S. did respond to that and said, we're going to invade if you don't take these missiles out. And the U.S. would have been willing to sacrifice any number of soldiers to make sure those missiles were removed from Cuba. So it may not be legal, but it's real politique. This is the way regimes operate. Nobody likes nuclear missiles on their border. So when they got up to Ukraine, Putin said, if you threaten to absorb Ukraine on our border, which means taking over Crimea and putting your missiles right next to our border, we're going to invade for regime change. We're going to change the regime that the U.S. had helped install in that coup in 2014. Uh, so Biden gets up and says, "Oh, I'm going to predict that Russia's going to invade, and we've got good intelligence." That was pure nonsense. Putin had told him that we're going to invade if this happened, and sure enough, Zelensky says, "Well, we're going to join NATO," and so Russia invades. And so I completely agree with you on Trump and this deal-making mentality of his, but I don't think he realizes, or maybe he does, that the root of this, in my opinion, is NATO. That as long as NATO's there and is able to absorb Ukraine, Putin's not going to make a deal. That's why he invaded in the first place. Even if Trump says, I promise you that Ukraine won't join NATO, and even if Zelensky says, okay, I promise we won't do this, go ahead and remove your troops back to Russia, how can he trust them? They would break their word in a New York minute, where overnight, oh, we've just incorporated Ukraine, and the next morning it's a fait accompli. So to me, the only real solution to this is abolish NATO so that Russia doesn't have to worry about this absorption of all these Eastern European countries anymore. NATO's gone. It's no longer a threat. But we all know that's not going to happen. And that's my second point. Why? And it's what I've long held, and it's the thesis of this book that I've long recommended by Michael Glennon, professor of law at Tufts University, former counsel to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, national security and double government. I've said this before, but I wish every single American would read Glennon's book. His thesis, to which I subscribe, is that it's not Trump running the show here. It's the national security establishment, the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA. They are in charge. They are the ones through NATO that decided we're not going to comply with the promises those politicians made in the executive branch. We run this government. We're in charge, just like in Egypt, for example, where the military runs the whole thing. And they ignored those promises. They used NATO to start absorbing because Russia has always been their great Cold War enemy, their official enemy, their rival, and whatever. And China, too, is just a replay of the Cold War without the communist threat or the communist conspiracy supposedly centered in Moscow. But they need official enemies, and Russia and China are their two best official enemies. It guarantees them ever increasing budgets. It keeps people afraid. And they, in my opinion, they have used Ukraine as an agent, as a proxy to wage their war against Russia in order to get regime change or degrade Russia, the same way they did in 79 when Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor, was asked about, well, what about all these Muslims you're stirring up that could do terrorist attacks on American soil and so forth? Brzezinski says, what are you worried about? We have sucked the Russians into invading Afghanistan. We are now giving them their own Vietnam. And I think that's the way they see this war with Ukraine. Okay, Ukrainian soldiers are dying, but they're not Americans. But the Russians know that the U.S. is there furnishing the weaponry, most likely giving the expertise how to do those weaponry, all that weaponry. And that's where the risk that you're talking about is coming in. That how long will they put up with this, where the U.S. is essentially using Ukraine as a proxy to destroy Russia? I'm not sure that's going to go on forever.
Well, the problem is that however much the United States may be a national security state, so is Russia. You can't presume that the US has a national security state and these other major countries are not. The Russians have the same ambitions. If you read the rhetoric, if you read the speeches, if you read the accounts of those around him, they are ambitious that Russia has a mission to save the world from Western decadence, from liberal notions, from a misguided and degenerate democracy, that there has to be strong leadership and that Russia has a mission, as was an imperial Russian attitude in the 19th century by those who were called the Slavophiles, the anti-Westerners, that they're on a mission to save the world, led by God. And they often use that phrase. And Putin has now become a born-again Christian in the Russian Orthodox Church. And the Chinese are the same way. Xi Jinping has a national security state. We know that because certainly there are labor camps, there's re-education camps, there's surveillance, they're building up a huge military, and they have their own ambitions, building these artificial islands in the South China Sea. Their idea of an expanded return to China being great again, a world power, the center of the world. So the problem is that it's not just the American national security state. We're in a world of several large countries, each of whom has a national security state and agendas for their own preservation, maintenance, and growth in conflict with each other. And that's the great dilemma that the world faces.
I completely agree with you. I mean, North Korea is a national security state. The question is what do we do about this situation? I mean, the U.S. was converted to a national security state because of that reason, that the Soviet Union was a national security state. The argument was we can't defeat the Reds, the communists, unless we become a national security state also. I question that. I think it was the worst mistake in the history of this country to copy the governmental structure of the Soviet Union in Red China, that we would have been better off fighting them or opposing them as a limited government republic rather than converting to a national security state. And I still believe that that's the solution to this, that restore America to its original foreign policy of non-interventionism. Does that mean that that settles the war between Ukraine and Russia? No. They might continue going and fighting. You may be right. I think you are right in the sense that if they don't get U.S. support, they're going to crumble and Russia's going to win it. But, it's that old speech by John Quincy Adams that America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. There's a lot of monsters around the world. And you can talk about the national security state, the communist regime in China, national security state in Russia, and so forth. A lot of monsters. But the U.S. should not go abroad to slay those monsters. The U.S. should bring all its troops home, close all its bases overseas, discharge all those soldiers into the private sector, restore a limited government republic to our land, dismantle the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA, have a basic military force comparable in size to what we had in, say, 1890, and then the world goes along its way. And of course, you and I believe in free trade, open borders, free movements of people, where America then becomes a shining model of what freedom is all about, where people look to us to say, hey, yeah, that's the model. That's what we want. Instead of copying Russia and North Korea and China and becoming like them in the ostensible goal of trying to defeat them.
You see, I think that the false hope that even some libertarians had given to Trump is that they thought that that was the type of world that he wanted to move back to. But that's not. Now, whether it's his own notions of America being great and that requires, well, the way he even speaks, you know, America has to remain the industrial giant of the world. We have to be number one. We have to be the greatest. We have to be the strongest. That's why he's increasing the defense budget. America has to be the dominant power to which everyone has to bow because we hold all the cards. Look, everyone wants to trade with America. Everyone wants to have access to American markets. We hold all the cards. They better accept our tariffs and give us none of theirs. See, this is the mindset he has, and it carries over into how do you have this economic strength to manipulate and control and impose things on people through your willing and dealing if you don't have implicitly the military force to back it up if necessary. And that the fact is that Trump is the essence of a 21st century neo-mercantilist, a strong centralized government led by an authoritarian leader. Back then, it would be monarchs with absolute power, like in France. And the idea that the world is a zero-sum game. If the Russians win, America has to lose. So therefore, if America is going to win, then the Russians and the Chinese have to lose. And it's that zero-sum mentality and this neo-mercantilist view of the economic relationships of the world that has gotten him into this policy set, along with the factors. Look, the Pentagon doesn't want to lose its power. The CIA doesn't want to lose its power. It's the very essence of any bureaucracy, even on the domestic home front, that they don't want to lose their rice bowl of power, position, and income. And they will fight tooth and nail to see that nothing happens to it. Did Doja ever go to the Department of Defense or the CIA? No. Has this is there more accountable audits by the Department of Defense to show what they're spending the money on and why and for whom and with what outcome? No, any more than the CIA, because they want to protect their power and position as part of this permanent bureaucracy. They're just concerned with the important area and the coercive power of foreign affairs and the FBI, of course, domestic affairs. But just as much as the domestic bureaucracies are fighting tooth and nail to see that nothing gets reduced. And in fact, Trump is reducing nothing. Oh, thank you. You cut National Public Radio. Oh, gee, how wonderful. But the fact is, nothing is being cut. And that's because both his mindset and the stubborn attitudes and resistance of the bureaucracies are making it impossible for anything to occur right now. Now, what you're talking about, and which is basically the classical liberal slash libertarian message, is that what has to come about is a change in the climate of ideas. The American people have to ask themselves, what is it that America is about? What is it that America should be about? Which is basically asking the question, is liberty important? And if liberty is important, what does it imply about the relationships among human beings to each other, and the important but very limited role of government to secure the institutional setting in which free individuals can go about their peaceful affairs? Until enough Americans are challenged to think in those terms, nothing will really change in domestic policy, and certainly not in these foreign policy issues that we're talking about.
Yeah, your points about Trump are very interesting, but this returns us back to the beginning of the program today, that Trump came into office campaigning on against the deep state. I mean, how many times did he talk about the deep state? And he even repeated that phrase that he had used his first time, draining the swamp. And that's all gone, Richard. I mean, you don't ever hear him talking about anything about the deep state anymore. And I find that fascinating. Why is that? Why did he give up on that? Why didn't he just stay committed to what you're doing, what you're suggesting, targeting the CIA, targeting the Pentagon, reducing their expenditures? Instead, it's like, oh, here, guys, take more money, take more money. Why? Well, I would suggest because it's the deep state who's in control. And Trump has surrendered to them. That's my opinion, that he has succumbed to their power. Now, your last point, I think, is very profound. And I think it goes back to Americans have to decide what is the role of government in a free society. And first of all, they got to decide, do they want to be free? I mean, or no, actually, the first question is, are they free? Because most Americans believe they're free. And so if you believe you're free and you're not, you got real problems. But once you realize, okay, I'm not free, do you want to be free? And then the next question is, well, okay, if I want to be free, Jacob, what is the role of government in that society? Can I be free when I've got a government that is an empire around the world, that has omnipotent powers of assassination and torture and indefinite detention, including on American citizens, but also foreigners? In other words, our freedom and omnipotent government, which comes with a national security state, consistent with each other. And I would say they're not. People are going to have to figure that out. And once they figure it out, then they're going to have to figure out, well, then how do we get back to this idea of a limited government republic, which is what our Constitution established. And when they adopted the national security state, they did not adopt a constitutional amendment that affected that conversion.
Yeah. America is in a transition period. Of course, you can always say a country is always in a transition period, but in one sense, it is in a transition period in that the welfare state financially is approaching bankruptcy. Social Security is certainly facing the inability to, under the current laws, generate sufficient revenue to pay out all of the legal liabilities of those eligible to receive funds from Social Security. Medicare and Medicaid are will be reaching over the next 10 to 15 years, uh, its budgetary limits due to an aging population and a shrinking workforce to pay all the taxes. There, in spite of Trump's talk about deregulation, the stranglehold of the regulatory state still weighs upon the country. Added now and overlaid heavily with his spider's web of arbitrary and uncertain tomorrow tariffs and all of the effects that has on the U.S. and other parts of the world. Uh, and then the fact that the government has this power to intrude, to surveil, to take, to basically deny us when it wants virtually any fundamental civil liberty that most of us have taken for granted, at least on paper, in the type of things we learned in school. So all of these are slowly coming to a head, particularly since America is not this. There's no longer Pax Americana. There's no the American peace, uh, preserved for, quote, the free world during the Cold War, and supposedly in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, a Pax Americana for the world. There are other of these national security states having their own ambitions. So the world is becoming a more difficult place. And that requires Americans to ask, what is our position in the world, given the tensions and the potentials for global wars? So all of these are reaching sort of crises points and transition points that are going to require the American people to face a reality of constraints and limits and crises that will require them to rethink what it is government has been doing, should be doing in the context of shall we have an attempt to restore a free society?
Yeah, that's an excellent thought. And I would add to those things the drug war and the war on immigrants, which have their own police states. You got a drug war police state that has expanded nationwide. Now you've got the immigration police state expanding nationwide with assaults on habeas corpus and due process. You put all these together, as you point out, this is not a pretty scene here. This cannot end well. Along with out of control debt, $37 trillion now and climbing, the Federal Reserve constant debasement of the value of the dollar. This is a system that, like I say, cannot end well.
I
And
would just add here because, often people who are critics of our point of view will say that we're chicken little. The sky is falling, the sky is falling, the sky is falling, and the sky never seems to fall. And it is true. It has taken decades upon decades upon decades for the interventions, the regulations, the restrictions, the fiscal taxing burdens uh, to accumulate finally to a point at which, without knowing when, whether it's 2 years from now or even 20 years from now, that the system reaches a breaking point. But at some point, the modern interventionist welfare and warfare state become financially unviable. And when that happens, a crisis will occur, and Americans are going to have to look themselves in the mirror and ask some important questions about themselves, society, and government.
on that profound note, we'll wrap things up. As always, Richard, I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you all for tuning in. If you're brand new to FFF, go ahead and subscribe to our FFF Daily, which is free. And if you like our work, I would invite you to become a supporter, financial supporter of FFF. And those of you that do help us out, thank you again for your great support. We're very honored and we're very appreciative. that you help us, you enable us to advance liberty in this way. Richard, enjoyed the conversation, and I'll see you next week.
Until always, thank you.